everyone. I'm now calling the Los Alamitos Unified School District Board of Education meeting to order, and we will start this off with a roll call.
Mrs. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Boyd is absent. Mrs.
Here.
Catulli?
Here.
Mrs. Davidson and Mrs. Hell? Here.
Okay, the first item, this is a workshop portion of our meeting where we get all sorts of great information. And the first one, which I'm sure many people are interested in, is our update on contingency planning for the 2020-21 school year. Dr. Pulver, take it away.
Thank you, Madam President. Just for agenda correction, we do have community staff participation. However, we do not have any for this portion of the meeting. We have several for the next portion. We gave the community an option if they wanted to have their public comments shared at this portion of the board meeting, during the workshop, or at the 6:30. All that we have received have requested to be at the 6:30 board meeting.
Okay, so thank you for the clarification.
No, you're very welcome. So I think you are correct in the fact that I think everyone is wanting to know what is going on for next school year and the current contingency planning that we are embarking. As I shared at our last board meeting, I believe it was during the superintendent's report, that we have more questions than answers, and I continue to sit here today sharing that same result. And so I know many people in the community are really wanting to know, when will our timeline be? And I don't have an answer for that. What I do hope today that we'll have an answer for is when will our school year begin? There's one other step that we'll have to do to navigate that with our association to formalize that process through an MOU, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The state just released their guidelines yesterday. But those guidelines are for across the state of California. They now have to be contextualized into each county and contextualized into the Orange County Public Health Agency's guidance as well. So we are a bit away from having any clarity, but what we do hope today is share with you, we have surveyed our staff for some input. We'll continue to survey staff. We'll share a little bit about our committee that we have forming. We also sent out a survey to our families, and we will continue to send surveys out to families as we continue this planning. But I'm really pleased to share, and Mrs. Reed will go over this during her presentation. We've never received so many responses to a survey. We received over 5,000 responses. On our calendar survey, we had 2,600 responses, and about 4 years ago when we surveyed families about calendar, we had 2,600 as well. So whenever we survey parents about LCAP or other things, it's well under 1,000 or right around there. So this certainly is a topic that everyone is engaged in. Our goal is at every board meeting that we will portion some time to an update of where we are in our contingency planning. So the public should stay tuned. Obviously all of you as board members as well, but this is something that we will ongoingly update at every board meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Reed, our Assistant Superintendent of Ed Services, who really has compiled and is leading the work with our teachers on what remote teaching and learning will be, and then in partnership, obviously, with everyone throughout the district. And she and I have been working a lot as well closely on this matter, along with trying to make sure we capture the surveys. So there will be times in this workshop we'll want to stop and get further input from all of you. Like I said, the major input we'd like today to hopefully get direction is on the school calendar start date for next year. We've promised to our community we'd communicate to them by the week of June 15th. And how wonderful would that be if we were able to communicate that out sometime this week, which we even beat our timeline if possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Reed.
And some that we're still waiting from OCDE. And so to really be big picture in the work that we're doing, we've taken feedback on school closures, our emergency distance learning program that took place when our schools closed. We're looking at potential later start date, as Dr. Pulver indicated. We're purposely planning for the reopening of schools in 2020, 2021. And I also want to provide today, as part of the planning for 2020, 2021, some of what we're doing to reopen high school athletics and some of our visual and performing arts programs in a modified capacity. And so I really want to start kind of chronologically and take us back to when our schools closed. March 13th was the last day of school for our students, and we resumed our remote teaching at that point on March 18th after 2 days of closure, time to train staff on March 16th and 17th. And so when we really talk about emergency distance learning, we're talking about the teaching and learning that took place with really minimal planning time and also minimal opportunity to train staff. So we really had between March 13th and March 18th to put together a digital access platform and to really engage with over 400 teachers about how we would, at that time, our thinking was meet the needs of students for a 2 to 3 week time period of which our schools would be closed. As you all know, that timeline kept changing, and eventually our schools did close for the year. So when we say emergency distance learning, it really was what we could put together, and I think our staff did an amazing job in such a short time period to meet the needs of our students when the goalpost kept changing. And it really unprecedented in public education that we would close schools and have to, in such a short time period, completely redo the way we engage our student population. And so we really started initially by reaching out to our teachers. Really wanted to know, how did this go? When you look at this, you can see that we did break up the data for the board, looking at our elementary staff, our middle school staff, and our high school staff, really wanting to be able to identify where there's some unique needs in the different settings. When we asked teachers, how did the transition to working remotely go? 76% they were able to make it work. The other options on the survey were it went relatively smoothly from the beginning, or I continually had challenges as the time frames continued. So really across the board, district-wide, about 75% of our staff were really able to make it work in the conditions that we had available. Looking at main practices and challenges, assessment, really how do you genuinely and authentically assess student learning from afar. Best practices when we look at that asynchronous and synchronous instruction. So we weren't used to delivering our instruction digitally, remotely. So it definitely was, as we look at planning for next school year and the potential that a portion or all of our instruction could be remote, that is an area that we definitely need to engage our staff and continue to get better at. And then you can see at the elementary level, really lacking instructional tools. So it makes a lot of sense to think about an elementary school classroom, base 10 bars, magnetic letters, and a kindergarten classroom to teach sounds. So not having that manipulatives on a daily to use with our students was definitely a challenge at the elementary level. And we look at our older students, you can see that the third challenge that came up for teachers was communication with students and families. And so when you're used to seeing a student in class, you can check in every day during a period, and now you have remote distance, you're maybe not seeing that student every day, communication does become a challenge. Our teachers, I think it's amazing to see, it was over 90% they identified confidence in the use of Google Classroom, Google Meet, and Zoom at the end of our 10 weeks. We also looked at what percentage of your students were attending class time regularly prior to our change. And so I want to just remind the board, the change was going from a virtual office hours to set instructional time. When we first initiated that emergency distance learning, we really had our curriculum ready for 2 weeks, and we set up office hours to address needs and problems. As the school year goalposts kept getting pushed out, it clearly became evident that we needed to look at set instructional times for students. So at the secondary, that's when we went to that period by period block schedule, and at the elementary, that's when we began including small group instruction. Many of our teachers had already started making that shift prior to us doing it district-wide, but we went to that 90 minutes a day of teaching time. And so you can see at the elementary level, attendance prior to the change, we had about 64% of students attending 80 to 100%, but after the change, close to 80% of students attending 80 to 100%. I think where we see some remarkable changes at the middle school, prior to the change, 4% of teachers indicated that 80 to 100% of their students were showing up, and after the change, teachers indicated 84% of their class was showing up 80 to 100% of the time. When we look at our high school data, 5% prior to the change and 33% showing up. So a third of students showing up 80 to 100% of the time. I will note that at the high school, the biggest block of time, 47% of teachers indicated students were showing up between 70 and 80%. So when I drop that down about 10%, we're really looking at almost 90% of high school students showing up 70% or more. I wanted to keep it at that higher bar at 80% for reporting purposes because I think we all agree students need to be in class a minimum of 80% of the time.
I'm sorry, what was the percentage from 70 to 100%?
47% at the high school.
Oh, thank you.
When we look at work completion, 40% of elementary students turning in 80% or more frequent. At the middle school, 70% of students turning in 80% of their homework or more. And at the high school, just roughly 50% of students completing a minimum of 80% of their homework. And then we asked teachers after the change, was there an increase in student connections, an increase in student learning, or an increase in your ability to assess learning? And so what you'll see is that was a question that was on a continuum of 1 to 5, with 4 and 5 being the stronger of the two, 1 being the lowest indicator. So you can see that at the elementary level, when we look at student connections, 60% of teachers said there was a definite increase in student connections when we included that small group instruction. At the middle school and the high school, 67 and 51% said an increase on the high end of student connections when we went to the period by period block schedule. When we look at student learning, 54% increase, at elementary, 51% at middle school, but the high school indicated that they believed about only 24% of them believed that it was a greater increase in student learning going to the period by period. When we look at their ability to assess learning, elementary 46%, middle school 32%, and high school 19%. And so we did pose the question to our staff, if we were needing to be remote next school year or provide 100% digital curriculum for some students, should we purchase a fully digital curriculum? And you can see that the middle elementary, 85% of teachers do believe we should purchase an intact digital platform or digital curriculum for students. 55% at middle school and 52% at the high school. I will say, in reading through the anecdotal notes of both middle school and high school, many said they would support a fully digital curriculum if that was vetted through our traditional curriculum adoption process. But not knowing what that process would look like, they were leery to say that they would support purchasing a fully digital curriculum. Mrs. Davidson?
So could you please just articulate for me the increased ability to assess learning? Because I'm thinking of it two ways, so I want to know what that's saying.
So I think it probably could be interpreted multiple ways if you're taking the survey as well. So I think our intention of asking the question was, now that you were seeing students in a period by period structure, do you believe that increased your ability to assess their learning? It could be informally, it could be formally, it could be just via the dialogue that's happening and taking place.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And then we asked teachers, what type of support, if we were to be providing remote learning next school year, would you need? And across the board, it was support in best practices, asynchronous and asynchronous instruction. So we also wanted to garner some feedback for what this felt like and looked like in the home environment for our parents, who really were now the primary educators in multiple ways, many of them working from home and providing academic and social emotional support to their students who are now learning from home. And so we asked that same question to our families. How was the transition to working remotely? 55% at elementary said they were able to make it work, and 26% said it was an ongoing, continuous struggle. At the secondary level, 45% said I'm able to make it work. 38% said it went relatively smooth. So I think you can see that there definitely was a difference in the home environment from how our teachers were experiencing the transition to working remotely. When we asked parents what was the main successes they experienced with our transition to emergency distance learning, at the elementary level, accessing the digital platform, logging into class time, and then communication with the teacher. That makes a lot of sense when you think about a classroom of 32-to-1 or 24-to-1. When we look at 612, accessing the digital platform, logging into class time, and then the next success, completing work. That also makes a lot of sense when you think about the type of work a middle school or high school student can turn in that is definitely most likely digital prior to our shutdown. And you're looking at trying to collect work samples of penmanship and letter formation at the primary level, much harder to complete work that would show that mastery of a standard. When we asked what were your main challenges, at the elementary level, these are in order of percentages that parents shared with us. The main struggle was keeping their child engaged, while at the middle school, high school level, it was keeping their child motivated. Working from home, simultaneously supporting academic needs and struggling emotional health were common for all of our families, really transitional kindergarten through 12th grade. And then we asked, how was that amount of live teaching time? And so we said, not enough, just right, too much. And so at the elementary, about 57% said not enough time, 40% said just right, and at the secondary level, 64% said not enough, and 34% indicated that it was just the right amount of time. And I think it's really important to note that when we set out these times and these plans, it was never meant to encompass an entire school year, and so we did try our best to be responsive to that ongoing timeline that was changing for school closures, working in partnership with our teachers who gave 110%. For those of you who are working from home, who previously worked anywhere, it's so much harder to do any job working remotely if you don't have the adequate training, and then many of our staff and families doing that while having children in the home simultaneously. So we're definitely taking all this information into consideration as we're moving forward and trying to make best plans for not only our teaching staff, but also our students and our parent community. And so the potential change in the calendar really is that next component that helps put a timeline for Ed Services and the other departments in the district about best laid plans for the 2020-2021 school year. And so to really get some information not only from our staff but our parents, 2 surveys were sent out. And the survey question really was, based on the information provided, which calendar option below would you support? So staff and or parents at home could select maintaining the current school calendar with a start date of relatively August 5th and end date relatively May 27th, except for our Weaver families, or adopt a revised 2020-2021 school calendar with a universal start and end date of August 31st and June 11th for all school sites. And so when you look at the data that we got back, as Dr. Pulver shared, we had a great turnout of responses from our parent community and from our teaching community through LAEA. We had 75% of our teachers supporting a postponed start date to August 31st, excuse me. And when we look at our parent results, about 63% of our families, so a majority supporting that pushed start date of August 31st for the 2020-2021 school year.
Mrs. Reed, and what is the thought process behind pushing the calendar back?
So I think it's multiple, actually. And so one of the initial thought processes that was shared in the email to families was giving this pandemic an opportunity to potentially lessen restrictions that we may be under when we start a school year. So I know that as we look at the things that are changing rapidly week to week, hoping that we get to some place of normalcy if we were to wait later in the school year, or maybe we wouldn't have the same social distancing guidelines, potentially not have the same ratio of students, like looking to decrease. Maybe being able to start traditionally would be more of an opportunity for our students. The other was looking at information from families. There clearly is going to be a segment of our population that is looking for 100% remote or digital platform, and they may be until there is a vaccine. So wanting to respect that, we definitely do need time to contingency plan and make sure that we have something that we would say is the LoSal way of the way we would deliver teaching and learning in multiple settings. And so I think we're also held in a waiting or pausing game as we wait for county and state guidelines that give us kind of a brighter green light to move forward with planning. As I'll talk about in a few moments, we have started internal planning with a large subcommittee, but we're planning really theoretically at this point until we get some firm guidelines by which to plan by. So as Dr. Pulver shared, we did get the California Department of Education reopening schools guide, but it is also very general and vague and doesn't give any specifics as to the county health phasing guidelines that we will currently are in or may potentially be in at the start of the school year.
And that those guidelines were expected a week ago. So the state alone is a week behind, and with an early start date. We know we had to move into this program of emergency distance learning with almost no notice. And we know in order to put a quality product out there that we're going to really have to plan. And the revised calendar does provide opportunities for us to train staff on the front end. In the current calendar, our staff development days are embedded throughout the year, as they normally are in a situation like this. And so those are some of the reasons. The concern is that now it's even a longer period of time that students have been unengaged in active instruction. And so it's trying to weigh that balance of having a thoughtful and perhaps, I think as time evolves as well, the public gains confidence as the reopening plans continue across this nation and certainly the state and Orange County in various phases of work and life. And I'm hearing movie theaters may be opened up relatively soon as well. So as time evolves as well, it may give the public a bit more confidence too, depending upon what format or multiple formats we engage in the new school year in.
Diana, did you have something?
Go ahead, Marla.
Okay.
Well, no, I talked with a mother who had a room full of hopefully socially distancing AP students studying for the test, and she asked them which they would prefer, because a big part of our argument for early start is to give more time for the more advanced classes before they have to take the test. And they said they like it, they like that time when they're in the classroom, but given a choice between starting early or getting a teacher on August 31st, they said it would make it, their AP scores, their ability to take the test, their ability to digest and process the complexity of the material would be much better served if they started late than just to go ahead and start early in order to have more days. So I thought that was interesting.
And I just wanted to say that Mrs. Davidson and I were in the webinar listening to what the state had to say. And one thing to me that was very clear was that it was, one, it was going to be local decisions to a certain extent, and two, that it was an ever-changing line.
Yeah, he said they described it as this is just our first conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I can understand why what that extra month could provide.
Yeah, there are different things as well for it. So there's no crystal ball that any of us have that will be completely accurate in terms of will those 3 weeks give us a better opportunity to bring kids in fully engaged in person all the time? We don't have that clarity, and that's something that we're just going to have to take a look at. You know, the other concerns that we've heard from some people is if a second wave comes, could it be in the fall? So why wouldn't you start earlier when there's heat? Those are pros and cons. I don't know if there's a solution there or not, but no matter what, the time that we get to really put forth a quality virtual remote program will help us no matter what, be more nimble should we have to go into that, as opposed to using, you know, we're not going to be using the words emergency distance learning next year. It won't be an emergency. We now have time to thoughtfully plan to it still is a pretty quick planning. We've never gone through curriculum this fast. So don't get me wrong that this is not a normal process, but it's certainly more time than 2 days. And so we also, you might notice some of the, we surveyed teachers, LAEA surveyed their own membership. Classified did not, and I know sometimes there's a misunderstanding there. And that's really, Classified has been brought along the way during this entire time with the conversations, at least the Classified leadership, that this is a consideration that we're thinking about. But with our association, contract or school calendar is really in the management rights section. So it's not something that they would readily negotiate, but we always believe in being transparent and collaborative and have kept them in the fold. But CSEA has not surveyed their members regarding the calendar, and it's really probably because it's just not part of their contract that they would negotiate. We also surveyed our administrative group, all of our administrators. I did that as well. And it really honestly reflects exactly where LAEA's membership calendar vote was, which is 75% of our administrators support moving the calendar to August 31st, and 25% support keeping the calendar as is. And so I do think that's kind of nice that we reflect our teaching staff as well, that we're not lockstep all the way. And there's pros and cons either way with our parents. But I've never seen a calendar survey be 100%, or so these are still pretty telling numbers, but this really is where we're going to want to get our recommendation at this point is I think it would be hard pressed to respond to the survey results that we have, along with the pressing needs that we know we need in order to be able to thoughtfully plan our reopening plans. That we are recommending that we move our start date to August 31st, and would certainly like to get direction from the board with all of that. Before we could operationalize that, as I think I front-loaded at the conversation, it is subject to negotiations with our, with LAEA. LAEA is well aware that we're talking about this today. In fact, they might even be on YouTube. And so we would want to enter into an MOU. That's kind of the way that we've agreed to move forward with that. So once we have that MOU signed by LAEA and ourselves, we would then send out an email to our families. Obviously, we have a pledge to our staff that we'd communicate to our staff first, so they hear it from us first. And then we'd send it out to staff.
Does the MOU need to be ratified or approved by the
An MOU, the LAEA president has the ability to sign the MOU and enter into that. However, that is not something, clearly what Stacy Schmitz has tried to do is and really the bargaining team, because this is talked about at the bargaining table for a number of weeks, is to really get input from teachers before that would be done so arbitrarily. We really did want to be collaborative and make sure they had their membership behind them. And again, it's not 100%, but it is a compelling voice.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't have to like send something out and wait to get results, because we will never make it by the 15th.
Correct.
Diana.
And it said that we had 283 teachers respond, and I feel very bad about this, but I know how many employees we have, I just don't know how many of them are teachers, so what was that percentage?
A little over 400 teachers, but this is probably for a membership survey, this is a very strong survey results.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and Dr. Pulver, would you like direction now, or would you like Mrs. Reed to do her presentation?
No, I think we would. We're trying to segment
Okay.
this out. We'd like direction.
Okay.
Again, just knowing that we can't make anything official until we operationalize it with LAEA, but wanted to certainly have any input from the board on this
Okay,
further.
so Karen, looking for direction on the change of calendar?
For the 31st.
Okay, Dave, any comments?
I think 31st, definitely. I just had a quick question for you, and I know I apologize for being late here.
She's
Can we
surveying right
do
now.
the
Yeah, go ahead.
consensus
Yes,
first,
yes,
and then I'll
good.
go back
Yeah,
to you?
sure.
Okay, I am for the 31st. I want our kids back in the classroom with the
Just go.
teachers. It's the best way to learn.
I feel exactly what she said. I want them back in the classrooms, whatever we can do with short of a soothsayer and a Ouija board.
Yeah.
We need to give us the time.
And I agree with the 31st. I also think it is important. I absolutely believe that the students that are comfortable, I want them back in the classroom. And if their parents want them back in the classroom, that's where we want them. But I also want to respect that if there are some that need another option, I want them to have a good option. I want them to have a Wasau option.
Right. Okay. I
And we
believe-
really believe that's what's going to result.
Yeah.
We believe we're going to have to offer two programs, no matter what that
right.
one
Okay,
program be a
good.
completely virtual program. I think we have clarity on that already. It's really what will that second option look like? Will it, and Mrs. Reed will talk further, will it be a hybrid or will it be 100% in person? We don't have those answers today. We certainly will give you the feedback that we've heard so far in the surveys.
Okay. Dave, did you have a
No,
question?
I'll let her finish her.
Okay, Mrs. Reed, would you please continue?
Absolutely. So moving forward, as we're purposely planning for reopening our schools in 2020, 2021, one of the things that we've done is we've created a remote teaching distance learning committee that myself and Mrs. Davis, Director of Assessment and Accountability, are facilitating. And so we are 51 members strong, and we're really collaborating to build contingency plans for next school year. And so what we're really looking at, using the guidance that we've received up to this point, when you look at other reopening frameworks from LA County, from CSBA, even the document that now was released from the California Department of Ed, is really planning in 3 separate settings. A traditional setting, as I think everyone hopes for the fall, and that would be limited to no restrictions, traditional class size, and all of our students attending 5 days a week. A hybrid setting where students would receive a portion of their instruction at school, live with the teacher, and the other portion remotely. And there are many plans and models out there. Some have an early AM, late PM system where students come to school 5 days a week, but it's a shortened school day where half of kids come for an AM session and half of kids come for an afternoon session. Some school districts are looking at a hybrid model that's a 2-3, so it's an alternating 1 week you come to school 2 days a week and receive 3 days of remote instruction, and the next week you come to school 3 days a week and receive 2 remote. Some are looking at a 2x2 with a Friday flex that looks like a multiple options for students, so 50% remote, 50% in person. And so our group really is looking at all of the models and making recommendations at each of the levels. Some school districts around us are looking at only bringing back potentially elementary and doing distance learning 6-12, so using all of their campus to spread out elementary students. So the opportunities and the possibilities are really endless. So this committee is going to help guide us and give us perspective from the teacher lens, and they're the ones that have been teaching remotely, right, firsthand, about what they think is best suited at their level.
Quick
Mrs. Hill.
question. I think this is more for Dr. Pulver. If it was hybrid or remote, would that also need an MOU from LAEA, or is it once they've said, or does that not matter?
We don't necessarily believe it would. Some of it may depend upon what the working conditions are. Just because the students are remote doesn't mean that the teachers themselves will be working from home. We certainly could. One option is to continue to keep the same working conditions for teachers and to keep them working in their classrooms and providing the normal workday there within their classroom. But certainly we could entertain different aspects if we think it's going to be the right way to achieve that goal.
So we also, because the other thing that I heard was that there is still also not guidance on educational minutes. And so how many minutes we have to be providing for students as well, correct?
Correct. Well, the current guidance are the instructional minutes that every school district must adhere to. What the California Department of Education is hoping is that the legislature will provide a hold harmless, much like they did once they deemed schools should be closed back when we were on March 13th, when the governor signed his executive order, which waived the requirement of those in-person minutes. It will still have some teeth attached to it that you need to provide meaningful, authentic, home or remote distance learning, whatever. People will call things different labels, but yes.
And do we have any idea if they're expecting to restart testing for next year, or is that something we still don't know?
Something we still don't know. I highly doubt, just with the learning loss that everyone is concerned about already from this year, with these non-traditional models that are going to have to be, even with a 2 months planning would not be sufficient planning to really do the right type of a job. Districts will spend over a year or more creating a whole virtual academy. And so that has not been stated, but I will be surprised if we start to see assessment CASP for counting for schools next year, but I don't know yet.
Okay.
In terms of the remote learning, if it's partial, like a group of students, or if we are stuck with that altogether, are you creating your own curriculum, or are you going to look at finding one so you don't have to create a whole year curriculum.
So that's one of the questions that we're addressing with our group. We actually have subcommittees meetings scheduled for next week, and that is one of the big picture items. We have been already investigating 3 separate companies through our research that other local districts have been using prior to going into emergency distant learning. So we've met with Edumentum, we've met with Calvert Learning, and we've met with PPL to look at what they offer, and they do offer complete classrooms of digital curriculum with the complete scope and sequence already built for teachers to access. So when we talk about a 100% remote setting, on my information of today, that would probably be a recommendation that I would make if it was going to be digital for an entire school year, but we'll need to take our staff through that process and have them vet out the curriculum and the process. And so that definitely is something that we're looking at.
And then at 612, or really 912, but I believe there's an option at 612 is Apex, which we already use Apex for many classes and even our online social studies program right now. So at the high school level, that's also a continued option.
And if they go remote, will we still get the ADA?
Yes, well,
Yes.
Okay, good.
Now, a lot of this is all going to be subject, what I believe is going to be attached to when they pass the budget. There's going to be all these trailer bills, because when you pass a budget and then the trailer bills to the budget, they have immediate effect, whereas most other laws passed by the legislature have a January 1 effect unless the governor signs another executive order. So it'll be one of those 2 ways.
Question, just how have we tracked ADA?
How do
So
we
on-
track
on
ADA?
remote, I mean, ADA has always been really critical to our district, and we've had lots of restrictions and rules, but how do we track that, and how are we doing on that? in terms of-
I assume you mean attendance.
Yeah,
Is that what you mean?
So how are we
it's-
actually tracking attendance in our classrooms to make sure that when we get audited, we can say that
So
we...
all of that was waived.
Everything's
soon-
absolutely waived, so are we tracking it? Are we tracking it?
No, we have not. We did a survey of staff, asking them, it would be more their anecdotal data, but staff were not actually going in and taking attendance every single day, both when we started with the virtual hours or when we did the program. So that may change in a new environment when we're not doing emergency distance learning. That will be one of the things we're going to have to A, get direction from the state, and then B, figure out a way how we would operationalize that, either in a hybrid or a remote setting. But that requirement was removed as soon as the governor's executive order on March 13th.
No, I just because obviously if students aren't attending class or they're not on the virtual, either way, we're having so I know the state would do it, but were we doing anything, or were teachers doing anything to kind of help follow up with students or to?
Dave, I'm not sure you saw the first part of the presentation where
it
we.
has statistics on that.
I saw that, and I was trying to make sure I understood, but I just want
But
to know
no,
if
we did not take any
or if we-
metric. We
okay.
did not physically take attendance, nor had that expectation. We were given the hold harmless. And quite honestly, we focused our energies on other things. Now, that being said, our counselors and our teachers certainly communicated to administrators when students were not showing up on a consistent basis. And so we continued to reach out. But I will tell you, literally, the very first day that we made the change and we went to the period-by-period model, many of our principals sent surveys out to teachers to find out, did this have any change in attendance? And that result of day 1 or day 2 of that was what? It was close to
90 to 100%.
Yeah, where we certainly heard from teachers, oh my gosh, I haven't seen this kiddo the entire time
Right.
until we moved to a period-by-period model. So we do know certain things help support that. I think the other thing that made things problematic and certainly frustrating for teachers, for students, for parents, is I don't want to use the word lack of accountability, but even that you saw it tied into the motivation aspect. When you're told grades don't matter, your
Right.
grade stays the same, et cetera. So whether I show up or not, the trying to motivate a student to show up becomes a little bit more difficult if you're not intrinsically motivated. And there are many other responsibilities that we don't know that was going on in the home that really were more pressing.
No, and I understand. I just wanted to have a discussion about it and have it said out in public. Thank you.
So one of the things that we know is that these models really may need to be fluid. And so although we're planning them in isolation, we're also aware that at some point in the school year, we may have to transition from one of those models to another. As Dr. Pulver indicated earlier, there is some speculation that at some point during the school year when the flu wave hits again, that we may be asked to go, if we were to start traditionally, that we may be asked to either close our school doors or once again limit the number of students. And so we are keeping in mind that we have plans available to migrate from a traditional to a hybrid or from a traditional to a remote setting mid-year. Something else that we know we're going to have to start getting more feedback from our families is those parents, and you'll see soon in the survey I share, about 20% indicating that they would prefer, regardless, a remote program. So having to come up with a set date and time too, where parents would have to indicate to us that they're choosing a remote program for next school year as we look to properly, adequately staff our elementary schools and assign staff to being a digital or remote teacher for the school year. And then making sure that our families are aware too that there may not be an opportunity for them to rejoin us if further into the school year they decide that they do not like the remote option or that they'd like to come back. That would always be based on the number of seats that we would have available in our traditional hybrid setting at that time. So there's a lot of work, and I'd say that the majority of our work focuses around planning in these three settings and making sure that those pieces are somewhat movable and that we're able to fluidly transition from one to another if we were be called to do so. And so to finish really our planning and looking at those three settings, we really are going to have to align our work to the document that was released yesterday by the California Department of Education. But really what we're eagerly awaiting is our county's guidance on the planning framework for 2020-2021 as we look at the phasing health guidelines that will be used here in Orange County specific to where we're located. And so 51 members is a lot of people on a committee. And so I think we did something great, and that was we offered your attendance at the committee in a hybrid model. So we had 22 people join us in person, and we had the remainder of our participants at our first committee meeting join us via Zoom. So we're also trying to take into consideration our staff's preferences and comfort level at this time, but 51 is a lot of people in the room at any time. So the majority of the chunky part of our work is going to be happening in our subcommittees. And so we did, after our first meeting, I sent out a Google form to our staff where they were able to preference and give their indication to the subcommittees that they would like to participate in. Those blue subcommittees are large standing subcommittees that every committee member is a part of, just virtue of the level that they teach, so elementary, middle, and high school. And then our secondary 6-12, special education TK-12, hybrid learning TK-12, remote virtual learning TK-12, and mental health, trauma-informed instruction TK-12 will be breakout groups. We will address all of those items inside our standing elementary, middle, and high school, but we are a unified school district. So we're looking at something at hybrid models, although they could potentially be different between elementary and middle school. We also need to look at our families' ability to access the potential of multiple models with multiple children in our school district, in addition to remote or virtual learning, making sure that for students that may choose a remote model and may choose to stay in that model, we don't really know what the future looks like. Maybe that is an optimal way of learning for some of our families, making sure that that scope and sequence, kindergarten through 12th grade, would also provide them what I would consider, as Mrs. Hill said, a low-sal option of going to school. And so we're also aware that we may need to add members that aren't on our large committee to these subcommittees where expertise is needed. So if we do start to look at curriculum, including more English teachers, more math teachers into that discussion, and when we start to look at mental health and trauma-informed instruction, making sure that we do include our mental health team and our counseling team, K-12 as well, to that discussion. So to make sure that we got some good feedback at this moment in time, as you know, as the days go by, our feelings toward living in a pandemic and reacting to things like face covering, social distancing change. And so Dr. Pulver sent out a lovely survey about reopening our schools to our parent community, and we really did have an overwhelming response, as he indicated prior to the workshop starting, with a little over 5,000 total responses from our families and their current thinking on the reopening of schools. And so when we asked our families, if local guidance allowed and state and federal health officials allowed schools to be given flexibility to reopen in a normal, traditional, in-person setting with limited to no restrictions on social distancing, with their traditional class size, what would your preference be? About 78% of our families, TK through 12, indicated they would prefer a normal, traditional, in-person setting with normal class size. About 20% across the district said they would prefer a virtual learning platform, and about 3% said they would withdraw their child for alternate schooling. When we asked that same question and we said if we were able to offer a hybrid model where a portion of the instruction was provided on campus and the other portion of the instruction was provided remotely or virtually, would you have your child participate? About 78% at the elementary and 83% of the secondary said they would participate in a hybrid model, and about 11% of our families indicated they would still prefer a virtual program. And we had about 11% of elementary and 6% of secondary said that at that point they would look to withdraw their student or look for alternate schooling options.
So the interesting thing there is, as each question was going from the least restrictive to more restrictive, obviously, and so more people seem to be willing to get out of a virtual setting and go into a hybrid if complete in-person wasn't the main option. But we also had a dramatic increase of people who would say, I'm going to leave the school district. Mm-hmm. Now, that could just be conversation and not really reality, but it is interesting to see as things get more restrictive how our community is responding in some of these forms.
When we ask if you would send your child to school where face coverings were optional, 71% of our elementary families said yes, and 70% of our secondary families said yes. At that point, roughly 23 and 26% of our families said they would prefer a virtual 100% remote online program. 6% of elementary and 4% of secondary families indicated they would withdraw their children or look for alternate schooling.
And this seems to be a polarizing conversation as well with the community. All of you, I'm sure, as myself, have received emails from the community saying we must require face coverings or you should not require face coverings. Mm-hmm. We've heard from concerns at the elementary level that it's not very realistic for it to have our elementary students have those on. Many of our families with students with special needs have also communicated a concern if it was a mandatory, because they struggle whether or not their child will have a sensory difficulty to keeping the mask on, et cetera. So this really is also going to largely, this portion of schooling is going to be largely dictated by the public health care agency and what a restriction means we must, or if it's a guideline if we have flexibility. So it really should be dictated a little bit more along the science levels, unless we're given the flexibility. But it is one of those things that people have various opinions on in our community, and I know we're not alone there.
When we ask the same question to families, but now we say if face masks were required, would you send your student to school? At the elementary level, 69%. Say they would send their child to school, and at the secondary, 78%. At the elementary level, 18%, and secondary, 15%, preferring then, if face masks were required, a remote online program. And then you can see down below that 13% of elementary and 7% of secondary families say that if face coverings were required, they would prefer to withdraw their child or look for alternate schooling options. We then ask if physical distancing and or restrictions were in place during recess, lunch, or passing periods, would you send your child to school? 72% of elementary said yes, 81% of secondary said yes. We look at the numbers, 16% elementary, 13% secondary, then preferring a virtual program if face coverings were required during, or physical distancing during recess, lunch, and passing periods. And then we see 12% of elementary families indicating they would withdraw their children, and 6% of secondary families indicating they would withdraw their children or look for alternate means of schooling. We wanted to also find out the impact on families and taking care of their children during this time. Many people were at home working during this initial closure of our schools, but that could look potentially different as we move into a potential reclosing of schools or hybrid model. And so we wanted to ask our families, what would your child care plans be? And you can see that they are very, very different, and very different also because of the age of children at each level. So at the secondary level, you can see that close to 50% of our families indicated that due to the age of their children, child care isn't needed. But when we look at our elementary, 56% of families indicate that they can care for their children, or a family member can. About 27% would be interested in the district's fee-based program. 7% will look for access to childcare. But across the district, we have about 27% of families who say due to financial constraints, they fear that their child could be left at home alone during the school day. And so this is just a lot of good information as we look to plan, making sure that we have availability for our families who need it, and also planning resources for our families who might not have the financial capability to care for a child during the school day if they happen to be back at work.
The difficulty and the complexity. Sorry, my mic was off. And the difficulty and complexity of this is we have been able to provide childcare when schools were closed, because none of our classrooms were being utilized. So we had free reign to be able to use as many classrooms as we needed to socially distance to the requirements. If we're even in a hybrid model where we're using every classroom, but you're just decreasing the number of students, it will be what space will we have to be able to provide childcare for the half that aren't in school? Because the reason you would do a hybrid model is not to use half of the classrooms. You're using every classroom with half the number of students, or to some degree. You might be able to use up to 15 and 16. So TK3, we may be able to do things a little bit differently. But this will pose a real problem for our families, because we may not be able to really artfully provide alternative childcare program in a hybrid model.
If there's a child care program for, maybe middle school doesn't need it, but up to 4th or 5th grade, those students would be needing to have instruction during that time. I mean, it's not just child care. So would we have to, if we provided the child care, would they also be getting instruction at that time?
We would try. That's what our child care program tried to do. It's difficult because our extended daycare employees are now having to navigate this student in 3rd grade, this student in 2nd grade, when they had the office hours and they were all different. And so they would try to provide the asynchronous, which is really just the student going up on the internet and using Google Classroom or whatever resources that aren't the live instruction piece. So I don't know, that this is still will be problematic for us to be able to really be a true provider of childcare for families if we're in a completely virtual. We will look at what we can do. Utilizing outdoor spaces, et cetera. But at the same time, we're told we should be considering using outdoor spaces for even our regular instruction. So the complexity of this and the availability of childcare is very difficult in a hybrid model that we would be able to provide.
Yeah, that's sad. Obviously, our community needs it.
They absolutely do, which is why I think so many also are calling for trying to find a way to get as much in-person instruction if you can, and then for those families that don't feel comfortable, offer a virtual program. And then I think we've heard, if you look at the public comments that were on the survey, that was a resounding common theme.
And so really our next steps are developing an overview guide to the CDE reopening schools document. So the Ed Services team is currently putting together a highlights version of that 65-page document to share with our subcommittee by Friday. We have regularly scheduled remote teaching, distance learning meetings scheduled, as this will be ongoing work. Those 51 people were amazing in giving up their time. They knew ahead of time that it would be weekly meetings and time to get this work done. Even though it's not emergency, as Dr. Pulver shared, we're not used to rolling out a new program and curriculum in a 6-week to 8-week time frame. We typically like to spend our professional time and due diligence looking at all of that, and we will spend our due diligence doing that. It's just there's going to be an ongoing commitment to that work. Continuing presentations from digital curriculum providers. We're going to be sending a very similar survey to our teaching staff tomorrow that parallels the preference one that we sent to families in regard to starting traditional, face coverings being optional, restrictions in their level of comfort at this time in terms of teaching in those environments. ongoing Board of Education updates like this workshop, and then we really are truly awaiting the OCDE framework and guidance from Orange County Public Health, either on guidelines and or restrictions to what the actuality of our reopening schools looks like for the 2020-2021 school year.
And that teacher survey is really important too. What superintendents are hearing across the state, and I don't want to say this here about LoSal, but more about an overarching theme across the state, is there is concern about what teachers will be willing is the wrong word, comfortable and feel safe to do. And so will we have the teaching force in the various models that we may adopt? And so that's why that's important to also get their input as well in this process.
And along these lines, will we also have budget numbers? Like if we had to do a hybrid model, I would imagine that would mean we would need more teachers. Would we know what that associated cost is with that?
Right now, our thinking would be we can't afford to lower the class size.
Right.
And so what we would end up doing is you'd still keep our normal, let's say TK3, you can have our class size is 24 sometimes after the school year starts, you go to 25 when a new student comes in. We would still have that model. It just might mean that 12 of them show up in the AM and 12 of them show up in the PM. So I think that's also a misnomer, that there are some people who are trying to say, oh, if you remove X number of students, then we could have smaller class size. Well, if we did that, we'd reduce our staffing as well, because we can't afford to add more teachers to this process. So even at a secondary level at 612, if class size is 32, 34, pick the number, our staffing ratio is 32-1, but it can go up a little bit. They would still be the same number of teachers. You're just now, they're getting, instead of getting 6 hours of live instruction with a teacher, they may get 3 hours and 3 hours synchronous.
But somebody still has to teach that virtual.
That virtual portion would be home.
Right, but so it's just home, you open your browser, you do your work, there's nobody guiding you through that work.
It would be we hope that there'll be some supports through some of the online learning curriculum that we would be able to potentially purchase that would help teachers, because that is very difficult for teachers to be able to have to provide both. But it would be a little bit of both. But we don't believe right now that we would necessarily add more teaching staff to accomplish this. I don't know anybody who has a budget to be able to do that. I know there are some models that are looking to use paraprofessionals, et cetera, in limited capacity if you're just doing supervision aspects of it, but not providing the instruction.
Would we be able to use something like the Khan Academy that's free and out there for our math?
We have a wealth of digital resources that are on our website. Khan Academy is one of them that we've already utilized.
But as far as curriculum, I know it's a daunting task. I can't even imagine trying to do this. But if you could look at a lesson, since you're only getting an hour and a half from a teacher a day, and then be able to then then have a moment where you could, on Friday, maybe you have an hour to ask questions. I couldn't get this one, or I don't know.
So I would think ongoing that would be really difficult for most students. So Khan Academy was developed as a way to either front load or stand as a review for mathematical concepts, not to replace direct instruction. So even for an independent learner or an at-grade level student who would self-teach through Khan Academy, they still would have to be explicitly trained in note-taking and asking questions to be able to utilize and maximize their 1 hour of time they have to ask questions over a sequence of time. And so in math particular, I think across the country and specifically in California, we've struggled with math instruction. And so to think that we would rely on something built for front-loading and or review, I think would be very paralyzing to what we would see in terms of our mathematical development with our students.
Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, there must be some things out there that you're having to find if we do go to this hybrid. I'm not sure to get the tools. Because I know, and then do we have a plan then to help teachers? Because I know myself, I'm not real effective on a Zoom appointment with a client trying to present things to them, because I'm just haven't done it enough. I haven't been trained in
And our
doing
teachers did indicate on the survey that was at the top of their list of needs, was the best practices of asynchronous and synchronous instruction.
Okay.
And that's why you heard some districts, if they are exploring the hybrid model, rather than doing a 2-3, 2-3, 2 days, 3 days, of doing a 2 and 2, and they would use 1 day a week to really continue to provide professional development for teachers, to provide planning time so that, because how do you plan for this asynchronous time to upload stuff onto the website when they're not with them live, and so that they would have that time on that Friday to be. It could be a Monday, it could be a Wednesday, I'm just making that up in this model. But that's why some are looking at a model like that, is on that other day to provide that professional development, the collaboration time, and the planning time to upload the non-live instruction.
Okay, I just want to make a comment, is that we haven't heard from Dr. Nyan yet. Because we actually kind of don't want to hear from you, because I don't think you're having. I hope you have some good news. I've already been depressed and eaten enough chocolate. Oh, okay, good. Options are always good. So this is an incredibly rich and very important conversation. We all have opinions, we all have questions, and we all want to fix it the way we want it fixed. But please continue, Mrs. Reed. So sorry.
Absolutely. So the last part of this workshop is really focused on our modified reopening of high school athletics and visual performing arts at Los Alamitos High School. And so we've aligned ourselves to the National Federation of State High School Associations and Sports Medicine Advisory Committee guidelines that were published about 10 days ago. And we've taken that and really aligned it to Orange County's public health phasing guidelines. So the guidelines are actually presented in phase by phase, and the recommendation from the national board is to take the national recommendations and then align them to your county phasing guidelines. And so our guidelines are aligned to phase 2 guidelines, as we are currently in phase 2 under the Orange County public health phasing guidelines. And so we are starting opening up modified tomorrow on June 10th. So June 10th and 11th, we will not have any CIF sports on campus, as our CIF dead period ends on June 11th. And so June 12th, they could potentially come back, but we've decided together that we would kick that off June 15th to begin. CIF sports could begin their workouts under the phase 2 guidelines. And so the guidelines really take all sports and they label them into 3 categories: low-risk sports, moderate-risk sports, and high-risk sports. And the level of risk really is the amount of contact that an athlete would typically encounter, athlete to athlete, if their sport was to actually play a game of practice or competition. So it makes sense that a sport like track or golf is low risk, as there is no interfacing of contact of athlete to athlete, where wrestling, football, competitive cheer is high risk, as there is a lot of opportunity for contact in the game. And so currently, unfortunately, although these guidelines were recommended to be applied to visual performing arts, the current guidelines really state no implementation for singing and the playing of wind instruments currently, based on the research that's coming out that large vocalizations and the playing of wind instrument further spreads the droplets, which we know is one of the main ways that COVID-19 does spread. And so as we look at phase 2, the key guidelines that we're operating under are 10 people or less indoors, 50 people or less outdoors. We are not using locker rooms. We're always maintaining 6 feet of distance. There is no athlete contact, and there's no shared personal equipment for a sport. All of our sports can resume workout, so even football could resume a workout, but it would not look like a traditional football workout. So any of our high-risk sports, we're actually asking them to submit a proposal, an outlined, detailed workout plan for what will happen during their practice or training. And so our coaches have been absolutely amazing. I'll have to say, Coach Fenton has been brainstorming on the board and sending me emails and plans. We're actually meeting tomorrow since these guidelines came out, and our coaches have gotten very creative of ways they can still engage their athletes for independent drills, for agility, endurance training, to still really work on the physical aptitude of our athletes. Low-risk sports can actually resume practice, like tennis, and our moderate-risk sports can begin a modified practice. So a great example of that would be volleyball. So they can start playing like a 3-on-3 game and using a volleyball, and when the ball actually comes out of play, then that ball is out, and the new clean ball comes in. That ball that just got out on the play is now sanitized before it comes back into play. So there's a lot of specific details about what each of these sports and athletics practice summer workouts can look like that's outlined in our full plan that's available on our district website under our reopening guidelines. So before a sport can begin any practice or submit a plan, the coach must attend the LAHS athletics reopening training. And so we've already completed 2 of those. We had a training yesterday, a training today, and we have a 3rd training tomorrow. And so Melissa Davis and Richard Smith are providing those trainings to all of our coaches and assistant coaches who will be supervising student athletes and or performers during phase 2. In addition, parents sign a notification consenting to their student coming on campus under the current guidelines that I'm going to review in just a moment, so that we have their consent as well as the student athlete sign consent that they can abide by the guidelines, and or potentially they could jeopardize their participation in summer workouts while on campus. And so really all programs will notify parents and guardians of their reopening measures for their program of sport. So that looks very different from tennis to golf to cross country to wrestling. Exactly what would the student be doing when they come to a summer workout? All athletes will be intaked coming in through the east student parking lot, and we have set up an intake tent adjacent to the gym that will be the athlete check-in table. All athletes and coaches will be wearing face coverings as they enter and exit practice at any time, and when they cannot maintain 6 feet of social distance. All athletes and coaches will have their temperature taken and recorded on the NFHS monitoring form upon arrival each day. And athletes with a temperature of 100.3 or lower will actually be given, it's a bright green circular sticker with the date that will be written on it, indicating in a really easy measure for coaches on the field to see who has checked in, who's clear to be here today. And athletes with 100.4 or higher will actually be sent home for practice on that day, and will not be cleared to come back to practice for 14 days or until they provide proof of a negative COVID-19 test or give us a doctor's clearance to resume practice. After a temperature check of an athlete or a coach, they will have to wash their hands and or use hand sanitizer. We'll be utilizing a drop-off and pickup procedure where only athletes will be coming onto campus, and all parents or guardians will be remaining in their vehicles in the East student parking lot. We've actually set the parking lot up so that middle aisle that comes down, like you're going to drive into campus, is X'd out every other place as a dropout lane where athletes can clearly wait 6 feet apart from each other upon being picked up at the end of practice. To ensure that all participants are 6 feet apart while checking in, while being picked up, and in common areas, the site has gone through and taped off indicators like you would see in our local grocery stores right now or Target, so that's really clear to students where they should be waiting. Now, after athletes are checked in, their temperatures checked, and they are able to go to the field, the gym, their court, their area of practice, and they're able to go to 6 feet of social distancing, they are able to take their face covering off. But any athlete who feels more comfortable wearing a face covering all time, it's perfectly acceptable to do so, and the same applies for our coaches as well. Anytime an athlete traverses a location, so an athlete leaves practice and has to use the restroom when they come back, they'll also have to hand sanitize. If you're going through a rotation in your sport and you just got done working out and now you're traversing to field activities, you'll also have to wash your hands and or use hand sanitizer. So also the guidelines call for anytime an athlete transfers locations that they'll re-sanitize their hands and or equipment. And so we're really excited about this from the information that our parents shared with the struggles and their worry about their child's mental health. We really feel that this is an amazing opportunity, not only for physical activity for our kids, but also for them to reconnect to that trusted adult. We all know the value of connection, and so our coaches have amazing relationships with our students, and there's nothing more important for some of our students than being part of a team, right? That feeling of success that they get. And we know that for many of our students, it's the reason that they show up to school. We say we're about the 4 A's, and 3 of our A's are really dependent upon having students on campus to have that experience. And so I'd like to thank you for your time and answer any additional questions that you may have today.
The only other question I have is about incoming freshmen. Are they going to be part of those workouts? Are they going to have those opportunities?
Absolutely. So we are continuing to partner with LAIF. And so for some of our activities and sports and programs where kids have already been selected, so I'll use song and cheer, for example. They did in Ricky's dance program. They did a virtual tryout at the end of the school year, so they're freshmen already in the program. So as they're having on-campus practices, they're included in that. For some of our sports, I'm going to give football as an example, who hasn't yet had a tryout and usually uses their football week to do that. They're going through LAIF and utilizing a camp with 50 or less in rotation, where all 8th graders will also be able to sign up for that camp and come out for summer workouts as well. We currently aren't opening up any athletics to our TK through 8th grade. This is all our incoming 9th through 12th graders, as we don't currently have guidelines for youth sports. These guidelines were specific to high school age athletics.
Great, thank you very much.
Mrs. Reed, can you also just share any feedback about if a family member does not feel comfortable for their child to participate in any of these? Are there any implications to that?
There are absolutely none. So our training is very specific with our coaches. This is completely voluntary summer workouts and really not even practice. As you can see from the chart, there's very few sports that can actually practice competitively. This is mainly more about drills. And so in all of our communication out, an athlete that chooses or family that chooses not to participate in summer will have zero impact or be penalized for anything that would be happening potentially in the fall or spring of this upcoming school year. And I think we should note that the guidelines do recommend also that vulnerable athletes with underlying health conditions actually not participate in the phase 2 implementation of summer workouts. And so we've also shared that very detailed reopening plan with our coaches. Really was a 90-minute training where we went through the guidelines line by line, answered questions, and did a separate training on the spread of COVID-19 and when to seek emergency medical attention with our coaches as well in the event that something would happen while they were on campus. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to have a presentation by Dr. Nguyen.
And so while Dr. Nguyen and our Administrator of the Year, Mrs. Galicia, comes up to present, I do know that we're running a little bit behind time. So one of the things I'm very proud of is that all of you continue to stay informed of the state budget. And so some of the first few slides is really about that. And almost as soon as we print it, it's not worth its weight in gold, because the legislature also has made some changes. But what really the focus that we want to get from all of you today is to get some direction. We will be adopting our district budget at our next board meeting the end of June, and so we want to make sure we get the right feedback from you of how to make some of those decisions, because you'll see it's not a pretty budget, but we may see some changes from the legislature and the governor when they pass it, hopefully by next week.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll go fast so that at least for some of the slides and the key ones, we want to make sure that we spend time to get your input so that we can finish developing our budget, which we're taking to the board in 2 weeks. So as you have seen, COVID-19 has had significant impact to the world. And as well as in California, as we have seen so far. But the biggest thing I want to take away from this slide is the personal income tax deadline went from April 15 to July 15. This has caused a major problem, as it's tough to know how much of the income is actually will be projected for that time. So it's basically 2 income taxes that a lot of the self-employed person would have to pay on July 15. So that's one of the key things that once we know that July 15th tax date, we would actually have more information on the current budget as well. So that's one of the major factor. And really the shortfall in the California state budget, we all know at this point, is the rainy day fund, which has about $16.2 billion. The entire dollar amount will be withdrawn over 3 years. That is part of the proposal. The Prop 2 back in 2014 stated that they cannot take out a withdrawal more than half in the first year as well. So there are rules that's associated with this piggy bank that the state has. And we already have known that deferrals will continue, I mean, will start at this point for the fiscal year 1920. The June deferral will be paid in July of 2020. Now, the following fiscal year in 2021, the April deferral will actually be, the current language is, will be delayed until August. The May deferral will be in September, and the current June will continue to be in July. So the time has actually been expanded for the 2021 fiscal year. So that would be about a 27%, because for each of those 3 months is a 9% for the LCFF funding for us, and so that would be a 27% deferral for those 3 months. These are the budget assumptions that we are using that was released for the May revise. The cost of living adjustment COLA, as you all have heard, there is quote unquote the COLA is in there, but as you will see for 2021 it's 2.31%. But as you will see, the proration factor is a negative 10%. So the net effect, the change to LCFF is a negative 7.92%. Now for the other out years,
Doctor, excuse me, is it compounded? So the first year it's 10%, the next year it's really 22.7, and then the year after that we're cut
it's a
at
great
50%?
question, and I have a slide to show that for
Okay,
that
thank you.
base.
I just
Since
wanted-
when we're doing the math, it's a net zero for, so it's a 10% for the first, I mean, it's a negative 8% about, and the following year it's a base. It stayed the same. So with the chart, it was so much easier. Like we're trying to play with different ones, and you'll see it right away. Like, oh, that's what it means. So in order for the out years to stay zero, after you apply the COLA, the base, the base grant, it increased the deficit factor in order to bring it down to the zero. Now, as you will see here, STRS was supposed to be higher. Now it's down to 16.15, but in the out years, it goes back up already to 18.4. For PERS, same thing. It was lower, now down to 20.7%. However, in the third year out, it became 25.8, which was very similar to what it was before. So the jump in those areas will be significant in the budget as well. I want to show you this. So just alone in the LCFF base funding for our district, our total loss in 3 years is about $33.2 million. So this chart, this is the blue charts you will hear. This was the assumption back in March, which was only 3 months ago, second interim at that time. That was how much we projected that we were going to be received for 2021, 21, 22, 22, 23. And this orange bar right here is how much we are now projecting using the May revise. So in 2021, you will see we projected initially at about $87.5 million. Let's say $87 million. But now we're projecting to only receive $78.7 million. That's a drop of $8.7 million in one fiscal year. Now, as we go on to the next fiscal year, we projected initially a second interim 89.8, so almost $90 million. Now, the trend continues. We are only receiving, this is zero base. So you're not getting COLA, you're not getting anything. It's basically a net zero. We're receiving projected about 78.8, so it's very similar to what we're getting for 2021. In the third year out, bar is even greater at this point. $91.7 million initial projection is now down to $78 million. That is a $13.5 million deficit the third year out. The total of these 3 years is $33.2 million, which is extremely significant for any school district.
And
So I think this chart.
This is where I just want to kind of stop and spend a little bit of time, is while it looks flat funding for the next 3 years, you've got to remember all of your previous budgets that you've passed, your second interims in January, et cetera, had vastly different assumptions about what the out years would be, et cetera. And so when you compare that suddenly with this new information, it's not just flat funding. That's what we're trying to show you with this difference. It's really a difference of $8 million next year than what we had been budgeting for the past 2-3 years. It's a difference of $11 million the out year that we, contrary to what, because the state forces you anytime you plan a budget that you look at 3 years out. So it's not just that it's flat funding, it's that ripple effect from what we were anticipating prior. I mean, this is a shockwave, quite honestly.
And it's overnight, literally. I mean, May Revise came out when we put in these numbers, and this is what happened. So now I'm going to turn it to Elvia, and she will be showing you the multi-year projections on the next phase, and then I'll come back and we'll do the impact. Thank you.
Good evening, esteemed board, executive cabinet. I'm honored to be here today. Unfortunately, these are not great numbers, and I'm sorry about that. But first of all, I really want to thank our leadership team. They've really gone above and beyond to really help every student and our staff members to make sure we're safe. And so we've done a lot of work. It's been extremely difficult, and I know we are facing some really challenging times. It's not just going to be 1 year. It's going to be multiple years, unfortunately, unless the governor really changes their assumptions that they're giving us now. So, this is going to be really difficult. They're going to be challenging, but I think that together we can make this happen. Ultimately, like I said, we have one goal in mind, which is the safety of our students and teaching our learning and teaching our students. And Andrea, thank you so much. You've done an amazing job. I'm so impressed. HR, you've come a long way. You've done such a good job with our staffing, so thank you. And of course, our superintendent, I can't commend you enough for the hard work. And I'm so sorry for the board because they have really tough decisions to make. So with that said, as Nancy mentioned, we have some really tough decisions and some reductions that we need to take into account for our 2021 budget. We've accounted for some reductions that we've looked at when we're developing the budget. We've looked at our normal staffing ratios. We've identified 4 FTEs, which accounted for about $500,000 in the 2021 budget year. And then, of course, it's ongoing for the next 2 years as well. In our elementary instrumental music, we've identified 3 FTEs, which equated about $375,000. Again, it's for the next 3 years. 10%, we've reduced 10% of our site discretionary budgets, which about $118,000. And we've also addressed 10% reduction in our discretionary departmental budgets. Unfortunately, it's not enough. It's about $1.4 million each year, $4.4 million in the 3 years. It's something, but it's not enough. So
Just before we go off that slide, I just want to reiterate, when we say in that first column, the staffing reductions, that is not changing our staffing ratio. Over the past few years, we have been able to stretch ourselves and be a little bit more, if we want to use the word generous in our staffing, to take a look at different programs. This is not changing that. At some point, we may have to increase staffing ratios, and that's when you start hearing districts talk about layoffs or other things. This is not that. This is just tightening our belt within the ratios we are supposed to staff at.
So when we plug in our multi-year assumptions based on the governor's May revised, this is where we are. And please don't kill the messenger, but for 1920, once we've looked at our estimated actuals, we've identified, based on closing of the schools early, we've identified about $1.5 million in savings in our expenditures. So at second interim, our ending fund balance was projected about $11.5 million. We're up to $12.8 million if you look at the blue bar. But overall, for 1920, our revenue is still the same. It didn't change that much from second interim. Our expenditures, like I said, we've reduced them slightly. We're still accounting for a one-time textbook adoption for 1920. I don't think it's going to happen this particular year, 1920, so those funds are going to be designated in the 2021 fiscal year. We do have the 6% reserve in the 1920 fiscal year when we close the books, but once we get to the 2021 and we plug in our May revised budget assumptions, this is where we come into a bit of a problem. So our revenues are projected overall. These include everything, LCFF, our federal, our state, local revenues of $98 million. Our expenditures are $108 million based on what we're assuming right now. And then again, we have another adoption of textbooks, approximately $1.5 million. Our transfers out, we've taken that assumption that we might have to reduce our deferred maintenance. Instead of $2 million, $1.5 million, and then $2 million to our Fund 40, which is our reserve for capital improvements. That brings us down to a deficit spending of $14 million. Bringing in our reserves from the previous year of $12.8 million, we're obviously still in the negative in that particular 2020 year of a shortfall of $5.3 million. So we're negative. We won't have enough to meet our 3%. So this is where the board's going to have to give us some direction on where we're going to have to make some significant reductions. As we move forward to the 21-22 year, again, our revenue remains the same. Our expenditures are slightly increasing, primarily due to step and column, stirs and PERS increases. We've kind of kept everything pretty much the same as far as our expenditures because we haven't made that decision as where we're going to start making those reductions in the outward years. Ultimately, at the end of that 21-22 fiscal year, we're at a $21 million deficit. And once we move into the 22-23 year, if we continue with that same trend, we are at a $40.8 million deficit.
This, I just want to call your attention to the line item. Sorry, for YouTube, I want to make sure our mic's on. Where you see the line item of transfers out. And so this scenario that Elvia is presenting and Nancy still includes, until we get direction from all of you, $2 million to our capital projects. Mm-hmm. And we have decreased in this the deferred maintenance from $2 million to $1.5 million. So that's where you're getting the $3.5 million in the transfers out. It's $2 million to Fund 40, which is capital projects, and $1.5 million to deferred maintenance.
Thank you.
Which we will get your direction in a little bit, but we wanted you to know this is you wanted to see the effect if you do keep that still.
And the 1.5 million for deferred maintenance, that's what we're deciding on, not what, because there is something that the state says we have to reserve for, correct?
Defer,
routine
not for
and
deferred
restricted.
maintenance. The routine repair is 3%, and that
Okay.
number will be dropping as our budget shrinks. So, but we do budget for that because we do have state matching funds still at this point,
Right.
and we are continuing to apply, but we still have some balances, though, so we have to maintain that 3%.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the other thing, when you saw that negative balance, is that's not taken into account some of the other reserves that we have. There will be some options, depending upon what happens from the legislature, that we may not be able to make many staffing changes to reduce, and over 80% of our budget is people, until the following year, other than through classified. But we do have some reserve levels, and one of the things that we've always talked about with Fund 17 is that is a fund to be able to help us be more thoughtful in decisions that we make, so that we have time to plan a little bit. And when we were in the last Great Recession, we did draw down a couple $1 million, I believe, I don't remember the exact amount, from Fund 17. And as money came back, we repaid it back. So this does not show that using those reserves levels yet. Correct?
That is correct.
Balances as well next, so that you can consider what are some of the options, and we did make some initial recommendations, so at least that will be after this slide here.
Correct. So the next slide here, you have our current fund balances. As of 6/30, we are projecting our Fund 12, which is our child development program, to have a fund balance of $7.2 million. It has gone down due to the COVID pandemic. It was originally anticipated to be about $8.5 million, but due to the reduction in revenues and continuing to pay our staff, it has come down drastically from 1 to 7.2. Our deferred maintenance fund currently right now has an ending fund balance about $669,000. Our special reserve for other than capital outlay of Fund 17 is $5.7 million. Our special reserve for post-employment benefits, right now our balance is $31,000. As you remember, we transferred $15.4 million to the irrevocable trust for post-employment benefit, which is completely outside of our county treasury funds. And Fund 40 currently has an ending fund balance of $6.9 million. That includes this year's $2 million contribution. and our self-insurance fund currently has a $6.3 million balance. The next slide, we've had several discussions about our transportation program, primarily because we really don't know how we're going to operate it next year with the guidelines. And it's a very difficult conversations that we've had. But I kind of wanted to show you where we were back in 18-19 with transportation. So we currently do receive about $667,000 from part of the LCFF, so that's designated particularly for transportation, as well as parent fees. We've received, in 18-19, we received $189,000, and that was based on 828 students that were transported. So our ridership was really high back in 18-19. Our total expenditures were about $1.8 million, which brought us with a general fund contribution of about $943,000. Currently, right now, for 19-20, we are our ridership went down to about 783 students. Our revenue is still the same, $667,000. Our parent fees went down from $189,000 to $115,000, primarily because we had to refund all of our parents their fees since they weren't used. We couldn't transport them towards the end of the fiscal year. And our expenditures went down to $1.5 million. So our projected general fund contribution to transportation this year is about $728,000. So the next 4 columns, which are assumptions, these are projections. Should we keep the $1 per ride? Should we change it to $1.5 per ride? Or should we change it to $2 per ride? But of course, that is assuming our riders are going to be the same, 780 or 90, which we don't know, unfortunately. So the last column.
Also, just before, so we've for a few years been able to keep the dollar at a ride, and we did know it was costing the general fund, but at some point we believed that it was a cost well spent to help reduce traffic within the community, et cetera. And so when you offset that, that is just some people might use that's part of the price of doing business and providing some other resources and opportunities. We're not sure we can continue to keep that dollar a ride. We're also really wondering, and I don't know if we'll have a decision today, but it's something that we need to start planting the seed with all of you, is whether or not we'll even be able to continue home to school transportation as an option for the majority of students, given right now, just yesterday, the California Department of Education's guidelines still calls for 6 feet of social distancing on a bus, which would dramatically reduce the number of students that can have on a bus, which would then dramatically reduce how many the revenue and or double your busing that you need, which we wouldn't be able to do. And so we absolutely need to be able to provide for those students that qualify on an IEP that require home to school transportation. We would still need to provide that, but we have to seriously consider whether or not, both given the funding and given the scenario of the extreme restrictions that are currently we are informed about, whether we'll be able to continue a home to school transportation for next year, what just makes it even more difficult for families next year. But imagine too, if we have a hybrid where we have an AM drop off and a PM drop off, and how would we be able to navigate that? So the decisions don't get easy, they just keep getting harder.
And the reason why we have the dollar, 1.5 and the $2 is the Long Beach Transit charges $1.50 per ride, but in Orange County, the Orange County Transportation Authority charges $2 per ride. So that was one of the bases that we thought, well, what number would that be? What number should we consider to bring it to the board tonight? And that was the assumptions that we used for that purpose.
And unfortunately, these assumptions here do not take into account the social distancing requirements. So we didn't have that until yesterday morning. So these are still just the same assumptions that we've operated a traditional school year with, the same number of bus riders, and we just put our expenses and what that would mean. So these assumptions aren't even fully accurate with new information.
But the numbers don't necessarily, there may be only 500 families and there's 780 students. It might be how many families, because I mean, you may have 3 kids in a household that ride buses, and maybe, I don't know what that looks like either. Have we surveyed, because the other thing I'm concerned I have is parents are going to say, well, I'm not going to put my kid on the bus, I'll drive them to school because I want to keep them less, I don't know, I'm just wondering if we
I think that'll
surveyed
happen
them.
for many as well. It's really for
Yeah.
those that can't.
Right.
And in terms of if you have a hybrid, the traffic situation may resolve itself just from an AM, PM, or a 2-day,
Right.
3-day. However, but if we have a total in person, even still, transportation with 6 feet social distancing
It's
could be
going to
very
be difficult,
difficult.
yeah.
And so we may have to seriously think about a special education transportation only.
I saw
That's one
a
option.
district in Florida, and they charted it out, and it would mean to transport the same students, each bus would have to make 8 trips for them to be able to do that. And that's just not, it's not feasible.
And students would have to be up at 4 a.m. in order for that to occur?
Yeah, we charted out, and we could only, given our size of buses with 14 rows, and it's every other row, only one on each side, we could only take 14 kids. And then per bus, that's on our the bus we have. And with the 8 routes, the one that we routed, most of the routes are under 15 kids. So the 8 routes were that if we were to have to transport kids, that we could only possibly do just special education transporting, and with the 8 routes. So that's one of the options that, that's a serious option that we have to consider when we open the school in the fall. So just want to make sure.
You couldn't even have the optional, like my son, we bought the bus pass optional, because you go, well, you got 14 kids on the bus or 20, whatever it is,
It's
and
only
now you
14,
can't go
yeah.
today, so
Right.
now
We
you've got
counted,
to.
yeah.
So I can see all kinds of issues, just logistically, it's a nightmare, yeah.
So anyway, just keep in mind, our multi-year projection is fluent. Things are changing daily. We'll wait and see what the governor proposes, or the actual adopted budget in June 15th, see what that entails. And once we know those numbers, we'll plug those in and see where we are. But at this point, we can only assume what the May revise provides for us, so.
I have a question about the busing and the hybrid model and all of that. Is it possible, when we do a hybrid model, you could do it by days? In other words, you'd have a full day of the computers at home, and the next day it would be in person?
Yes.
Like half of your class would do the computers, the other half would be in person. So the busing would be cut in half, would it not?
It would,
Yes.
if in a model like that. At least what we've heard anecdotally from some teachers early on in the committee and what even other districts is, even if you went to a alternate day, that more people seem to be looking at 6/12, but many people have concerns about not seeing checking in with elementary kids every single day. And so that elementary's hybrid program that's again the work of the committee, could choose to do an AM, PM, because the need to see elementary kids every single day is more critical. And we would want to make better decisions for the education on that rationale prior. I would hate to have busing or transportation be the driving force
But that
on what we think is
half
best
day,
instructionally.
You would have to have, you'd have half of the bus riders and the same amount of drivers, or actually maybe even more.
And you may be able to look, you put those who do the bus riders are in the morning. I don't know. But and then
You'll work
is
it
that
out,
the
I'm
right option as well? So.
So, as you see, we're about, we have about a shortfall of about $41 million currently, with the 3 years out. And so these are some of the options that we have initially reviewed and thought of at least to at least take to the board tonight. And the idea is the board will give us direction on which items, and we have a spreadsheet there that Gina can help me open up in a little bit, to see what number do we need to get. So the goal is the amount that's required. We do need the entire $41 million. So these are some of the options. Let me walk you through those. The first one is the special education, AB 602. This is the base funding increase. We are projecting at about $800,000 at this point. The caveat is we do not know what the SELPA formula could look like, as last year when we knew there were some, the dollar amount was quite different. So we are not putting that in the budget as of yet, but we do anticipate hopefully around that amount. The next one here is the retiree OPEB investment return. as you have seen so far, the board has done a great job. We deposited money only back in April. We already have, the last time when I reviewed it was about almost 900,000 returned just for within the last less than 2 months. So it is possible the board would like to withdraw 750,000 for current year to pay for the retiree. That's one option. And we will have assuming our investment, even at 5%, we should be able to get about 750,000 each year. So we have tentatively put some of those assumptions into as a one option. If the board chooses to have that assumption, we can build that into the multi-year projection. The next item is the lack of meaningful work layoff. As we have discussed that for current year, we knew that we have about 3 months from March until May that we continue to pay people. And some of them, we call this group, is more of a temporary, the lack of meaningful work. That's the term we've been using. If we were to do those notices in the second board meeting in June, which I've been working with Dr. Frazier, that would give us about $4.1 million of savings to the budget for the 2021 year. The next item is transportation for special education only. As you have seen in the previous slide that Elvia presented, this would generate about $1 million saving to the budget. And that will be, assuming that it's ongoing, that's the assumption we put in the budget to balance the budget at this point. The next item is the additional staffing reductions. And given that if we were to issue the notices in June, it would take about 60 days for that to be effective, and these are more of some time to do that, the first phase, and the next phase will be how long will it take us to do the next wave. And for the 2021 fiscal year, it would be just classified. That's the assumption that we have, since there are more rules with the certificated. But for the out years, we have built some assumptions for additional staffing reductions in 21-22 and 22-23. And the next item is additional books and supply reductions. We have already made a 10% school side as well as all departments a reduction for 2021, and our recommendation is continue in another 10% for the following year, and then an additional 10% the year after. So the third year out is very far away, but our goal is to make sure that we need to have some kind of assumption to balance the budget. Then the line down there, the last one line before the fund balances is additional staffing considerations. So before to balance the budget, we need about $2.75 million in each of the out years for additional considerations of different types of either revenue enhancement or some type of expenditure reductions. We do have Fund 12, we do have a $7.2 million in fund balance, and so that's something that we share in our previous slide, some of the balances that could be some type of option if the board chooses to. Deferred maintenance, at this point, there is $1.5 million budgeted for the out years. We are recommending it, and we have worked with CJ to see if that number is possible to drop that budget down to $1 million contribution at this point for the next 3 years. And obviously, we still have things that we have to still do. There are things like the roofing. We have warranties that we have to maintain. We don't maintain that, then the warranty will be out. So there are things that we still have to maintain, and that $1 million at this point is what he would need to make sure that we still keep up with some of the different maintenance projects.
To the state's point of where we get matching funds, is there a certain dollar amount that we have to put in to get their state matching funds? Or
That's the 3% in routine repair, which is under general fund, not Fund 14.
So there's not a certain dollar amount we have to put in to get the 3% match?
No, not for
Okay,
that.
all right.
It's just to be clear, it's two different things.
I know.
There's routine maintenance, which is one category, which is the state matching. And then the second one is deferred maintenance, which is your long-term when we're taking, like with the project that's going on at LAE, the parking lot with McAuliffe last year.
Right.
That's the long-term deferred maintenance. Prior to the bond, when we were replacing playgrounds, that's long-term because you hope to get a 25 or so year lifespan on that. So what our recommendation here already is why we recommended moving it from 2 million to 1.5, which we had received some input from you along the way of this year that would be a viable option if we thought it was doable. We've re-looked at this, and we think with the 669,000 that's already still carrying over in that fund and the 1 million for the next 3 years, we think it is a doable solution to be able to drop that from basically 2 million to 1 million.
Right, okay.
Thank you. And then you also see the deferment balance there, as well as Fund 17, Fund 20. The next line item on here that we are recommending a reduction is the $2 million in Fund 40. It's the special reserve for capital outlay projects. And I do want to remind the board that over the years, since 2017-18, the total fund balance in that account is about $11.5 million. So the board has already dedicated about $11.5 million to that account. Just so these other dollars that have not been contributed is one of the options that if we were to take $2 million each year out from the initial projection, and obviously it will impact some of the construction projects that it will have an impact since we are taking it out for the next 3 years at this point for the cash flow.
The reason that number is important I think for all of you to know is we did have a pledge to this community when we went out to take a look for Measure G, that the question was, how much skin in the game are you going to put of your fund, general fund, to help support capital outlay projects? And so when it looks like right now of 6.9, almost $7 million, but in reality, we have spent some of that money, obviously, with some of the projects. It's really been 11 million. That is more than 10% of the $97 million bond that we're asking the public. So I don't know if you've ever pledged a set percent, but a 10% of your general fund to help support these capital projects is a good slice. And it doesn't mean if we make these changes that is, again, as economic times get better, that we wouldn't, much like we talked about with Fund 17, replenish or try to contribute. But that just is something for you. That's one of the other areas we're going to need direction from you tonight as we are planning before we bring a budget to you next board meeting. Should we continue the 2 million in the out years? And another way to think about that is this year it was more than 2 million because it was the 2 million from ours. And then we got a $700,000 donation that we put there. So you could almost think of putting the $700,000 donation as part of your contribution for next year, as if it's already there. So in reality, it's part of that over 11% of the 97 million. But so to just kind of make sure, I wanted to make sure people realize that it really was the 2.7 million from this year because of that donation.
But that was part of the overall discussion, and we've already gone from 2 million on the deferred maintenance that we made to the bond on when we passed the bond, that we would have this for capital outlay projects and deferred maintenance, so that we wouldn't have to go in 30 more years for yet another bond that so we've gone from 2 million to 1 million there. We're down to $500,000, saving this, and then we're doing this here. I mean, we have to make cuts, but that was just one of the things, though, as a board, we kind of had made we didn't put it in stone, because I don't like to hold any board to those things, but that was kind of a commitment we had made, just as a reminder to the board that we kind of said we want to do those projects. And like you said, we have to do some of things to keep the warranties on the roofs and paint the facility, keep things up so they don't let them go into disrepair. So it's a tough deal.
In
I
our
just want to make
cash
sure
flow, when we looked at our modernization projects, we didn't have it 2 million in perpetuity. It was 2 million to, I believe, 2026. So to get us through the completion of some of the projects. So if that really will be ultimately the five-year decision to give us that guidance. But if you also don't have to look at it as stopping, you could be looking at it as suspending it for now. And if that means we have to push some of the projects beyond 2026 until you can account for some of those other funds. We also think if Measure K gets refinanced at a proper rate, we may be able to tap into a little bit more. We won't know that till this week, so we can't tell you what does that mean on those cash flows.
That's all out there
for
too.
that.
Yeah. Right.
So,
Questions and no answers.
but we certainly will know that before the next board meeting when you have to pass a budget.
Right.
And so, so with that, So those are the options that we have so far, and we actually have an Excel spreadsheet. So we can input those different numbers on there. If you can, because we can play, move things around. But the goal is we do have the balance of budget. We have excellent credit rating. We need to make sure we have that, and the balances in our other funds will help us with cash flow as well. So as you know, we will be looking at about a 27% minimum deferral for next year. So that that fund balance with the cash there will help us tremendously as well. So just kind of make sure that that's something that we do want to think about as well.
And that was a question I'd sent in and asked about was reading what the governor's doing and pushing things out. And this is not our first rodeo, right, Meg? The governor decides to pay us, do these things, and we'll pay you to it tomorrow. And how do we have cash flow? But you think some of this will actually, we don't know till we get it finalized.
Well, exactly. Since at this point, we have to adjust down our expenditures because our expenditures
Right.
are still at the rate it was. So we do need to take all these numbers down. And once we have that, then we will run the cash flow, because right now we run it, it will not look pretty at this point. But
that's what I was
we
thinking.
do need to at
That's-
least a minimum of 10 million a year at the minimum. And so with that would be about a 10%. So I think that's kind of how we do it. So we need direction.
So I'd like to try to help focus where the direction that we need. I think we need it right now, at least in 3 areas, and then correct me if we
Yes.
need it beyond. And I'm going to start with the easy, what I think might be easier to get, and then to more difficult. So the first is we are no longer contributing to OPEB, where we've built that up to about 15.4 million. We have wisely, this board has been very prudent and wise to invest that where we've seen already several $100,000 gain in the stock market. Now it's a stock market and it's a balanced portfolio, so it's not all stocks, as you know. But that could change at some point. We had originally been planning to do the pay-as-you-go, which is about $750,000 for our retiree medical benefits, to continue to pay that out of the general fund until we reach the OPEB's liability. We've actually reached it with the growth. Now, again, for the stocks in the market, it could change. We want to see about for at least the 2021, 21, 20, for the next 3 years. I'm not talking about 19, 20, although that is an option you could also consider. Rather than pulling 750,000-ish change for our retiree health benefits, to pull that from our investment that is already doing so. And in some ways, we believe our investment easily allows that and does. That was one of the reasons why we supported doing this, was to let those interest rates help support the general fund. So that would be the first thing that I'd like to get direction
Would
on.
you like to get them one at a time?
Yes.
Okay. Diana?
It's just on the OPEB right
This
now.
is just on the,
Yeah, I understand. So, but my question is that we're going to continue to pay as we go, and we're going to pull this 750 out? No.
In this scenario would be, we always have to account for the cost, but we would pull the 750 from the investment, from the 15 million from the market, and pay ourselves for that.
Okay. So we'd be paying ourselves back?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in favor of that.
okay. Mrs. Davidson?
I'm in favor.
Okay. Mr. Boyer?
Yeah, no, I think that's why we did this, so yeah.
Yeah, and
That's
Mrs.
one thing that's
Rosler.
working good.
Yeah,
So
and
do
I am
with
also,
some of this.
Not have an irrevocable trust, right?
right.
Yep.
Yeah. The irrevocable trust can be revoked in 2 days, yeah.
Right.
But this is a great thing. I mean, even
Yeah.
for employees, when they're looking at different things, it's our pledge to our retirees, and it's now not costing our general fund. So really wise that all of you invested those funds in a much higher return, about a 5% return right now than the county treasury. So we've got clarity on for 21, 22, and 23. I'm not sure, do you want to recommend that for this year? I'm not, but that was one of their questions?
Well, yes, because, right now, I think what I discussed with Dr. Kapulver was, if we can have the cash there right now to invest, we are doing very, very well. And so is one option is to leave the money there until we need the money. meaning that just leave the 750 even for this year. We have enough already at this point to even pull it out, but in terms of investment, since we're doing well, why not just leave the cash there? And then we do need it and pull it back at some point. So that's the recommendation. We probably shouldn't take it, but I think that's one option. If we, a couple months away, if we do need it, we can always access it. And with Keenan product, we can always go back in prior years, as they told us. So we can always have that option down the road and not right away.
Okay, so do you need direction for not taking the cash, but paying for the OPEB this year out of our general fund?
So our recommendation, staff's recommendation, is not for this year.
Right.
It's to do it for the 2021 budget and the next 2 years as well, so that we can
That's-
build that into our
yeah.
multi-year assumptions. But this year, really, quite honestly, we've already paid for our health,
Yeah.
our retiree health care, and we would only do that if we needed really access for cash because of the cash deferrals, but that it would get paid back. But we are not recommending to use
Okay.
this year's
Yeah,
to
I
draw
thought we
down
were
from the
only
fund.
voting on the out years anyway.
Yep.
I don't know if anybody else.
So the second one that I'd like to get direction, and we're going to need more obviously when we take a look at staffing, but that's not going to be done in one meeting, is on deferred maintenance. So our recommendation at this point, we think we can still accomplish the deferred maintenance task, the minimum deferred maintenance task that we have to accomplish with a $1 million contribution over the next 3 years instead of 2. And also counting on the 669 that's already in that fund as well.
I'm for it, we just have to balance the budget.
Yeah.
We have to balance.
We have to do it. We got
Yeah.
it. Thank goodness
And
we
if
have
we
it.
get,
so.
I'm more concerned in a couple of years out, and a couple of years out, we'll see what's happening.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I don't think we have a lot of choices.
So the third one that we want to get clarification, and while we're talking about, I want to just also be clear, while we talk about the multi-year projections in the next 2 years, the board next year could give us a different direction, obviously, and put those back, right? You're just making a decision now on that, is to suspend the transfer out of $2 million of the general fund to Fund 40. Or if it's not to suspend all of it, do you want to consider a reduction from 2 million to you pick the dollar amount?
Is that,
So-
you're saying Fund 40, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I really believe that we will see a faster rebound than we saw in our last recession. And so I'm good with doing it as a projection now because that's easier, in my opinion, that's easier to flex with than stopping all transportation or, and I don't know, we still may have to make that choice, but I'd rather make these easy choices that allow us to have that flexibility. If things change, boom, then we
Put
can
it
go
back
back
in.
and put it in, rather than firing
Are you
people.
saying do it for now, but if we need to go back and change it, to change it?
Yeah,
To take it out later.
Yeah, I could go for that.
I support that.
Yeah, this doesn't directly affect the staffing numbers. This isn't anyone's real specific job, because frequently these are,
No, this is for district's general fund contribution to, let's say you didn't have enough money to finish the gym or to finish modernization.
Right.
It's for
but they're
facilities.
not usually our employees who are
It is
doing this.
not for employees.
Yeah. So, and I really am truly committed to keeping our money, the promise that we made to our community, made it to myself, because I'm part of the community. But I agree with Mrs. Hill, we have to go for low-hanging fruit that in the next year or two is not going to have the impact on our students that other cuts will have. So I'm in support of this. And I need to hear from Mr. Boyer and Mrs. Davidson.
And I don't envy you when you're here next year on the budget, when I'm not here. But this is something you need to dig into now, because we haven't gotten to the toughest cuts, which are going to be people. And are going to have to, they're inevitable. So we have to do these things so when we work with our associations, they know that we're doing the very best we can.
Yeah, remember you saw a
because
$33
yes.
million.
So these are peanuts, and so
Yeah.
compared to that, because people are our biggest expense. So yeah,
Yes.
we work hard, and I'm glad we've had Fund 40. I've always heard a lot of argument, why do we have this Fund 40? We have it for times like this. So
Okay,
yeah.
and Mrs. Davidson?
I go for the least painful because I really liked what you said, the optimism about the future. And we really are uncertain about right now, so yes, let's go for the least painful ones.
Okay. So you
And
you have your direction.
We have direction on those three. I just want to, as you might see again, why is it 33 million on the one page and on this page it's 40? Because we have been, for the past couple of years, deficit spending. So that 33 million is just the change. We already knew we were doing some deficit spending that we would have to tighten our belt. This 40 million reflects the deficit spending and that 33 million. And so this becomes a bigger avalanche to tackle. So we will have to, there will still be more difficult conversations moving forward.
So we'll be using this budget assumptions in our multi-year projection when we take to the board on June 23rd. So we'll, thank you for the direction. It's very, very appreciated, so we can move forward with our development budget. And just very quickly, on the June 23rd board meeting, we'll be taking a fiscal solvency statement that the board will have to implement a certain dollar cuts, which we'll calculate now based on the direction you have given us for 2021 and as well as 21-22 as well. So for the two out years. In terms of timeline, so the current budget, as we have said, is built based on the governor's May revise. As you know, on June 3rd, the Senate and the Assembly reached an agreement, and their state budget is a little different. They're actually funding the COLA, so that's very different than what the governor proposed, providing an average daily attendance, hold harmless, in the event that we go a different direction for instruction, and as well as the amending the special ed portion of funding as well. So they will need to adopt a budget by June 15. We know that, so that will be good. So by the time that we come back on June 23rd, we should have more information at that point to see what the budget look like, and we can adjust as well as needed at that point. And it's probably the state will probably likely to revise its budget when more information become available later this summer. The July 15 date will be critical as the personal income taxes that will come through as well. And so we appreciate you being here today to give us direction, and we are happy to answer any questions that you may have that weren't asked so far.
Any additional questions from the board members? I know. Okay, if not, we're going to go ahead and recess.
6
No, we're
o'clock.
going to go into closed session, right? Yes. Okay, so we're now going into closed session. We will return to open session in a half an hour at 6:30.